Hey everyone, welcome to another conversation. This fellow needs really no introduction, but I have for some insightful discussion here Daniel Görtz, writer behind Hanzi Freinacht and the emerging, what would it be, a heptology? What would you call a 6 volume
I
collection?
don't really have a word for it.
Yeah,
It's the Hanzi series.
the Hanzi series. But so far, Listening Society Volume 1 and Nordic Ideology Volume 2, soon to be followed by many more illuminating and fascinating works. And For one, yeah, this is a treat to finally be able to have some conversation about some issues. So I guess without further ado, I'd love to just kind of hop into it and throw some questions by you. But I with there's so many ways we could kind of contextualize this, and I think that probably we could talk about the topic of metamodern spirituality at some length. So, but you know, needing to pick a place, why don't we start with a little context, because I feel like that would be helpful. And for me, one of the contextual issues that comes up a lot is sort of appreciating and differentiating and understanding some of the different lineages at play here. And so, for example, my Metamodern spirituality Facebook group that I am, actively involved in, we have a lot of folks who come from the integral community, and there's a lot of people in general who come to metamodernism through the integral community. So I was hoping you could say a little bit just at the outset. What's the relationship, as you would say, between metamodernism and integral?
I mean, just on a very basic level, both purport to describe something that goes beyond and comes after what we have gotten to know in so many ways as postmodernism and postmodernity. So. If you differentiate a bit further from that point of departure, that's basically what they have in common, just on a surface level. Both say, postmodern thinking has deconstructed the world. Now we can put it together in new ways, right? And as such, they tend to be, well, more holistic, more creative, more hopeful in a sense, right? If you look at the main popularization of the term metamodernism, and as we usually think about it these days, what Brent Cooper has called the Dutch school, it really had very little to do with integralism. The two strands were not aware of each other, and probably wouldn't have found each other that relevant. So integralism has come out of the spiritual Wild West of the American continent, and out of California culture, out of Boulder, Colorado, out of the counterculture, and then its developments over decades, which spawned unique intellectuals of that brand, like Ken Wilber. And primarily, Ken Wilber gave life to that way of thinking, whereas metamodernism came out of as you've seen in your as you've discussed in your interview with Vermeulen, no, Tim Vermeulen, yes, him and Van der Acker, they studied movements within the arts primarily, and they noticed that there is something going on here that is decidedly no longer meaningfully described as postmodern, and they saw, well, there's an explanatory gap between the code systems that they kind of imbued at university and what they were observing out there in the world, in the field, right? So at that point, they had really very little in common. Now, for me, I came from the integral background, not the modernist background. I was not an art scholar; I was a sociologist. I had found integralism at a point in my life where I felt certain level of disenchantment, had anxiety for years, etc. I learned to meditate. I picked up a lot of like those spiritual technologies. Around the same time, I was finishing master's in sociology, and I noticed that I didn't believe in any other maps, really. Like I could go and, there's something interesting going on in critical realism. There's something interesting going on in Lumen systems theory, something interesting going on in Habermasian theory and the sociology of knowledge. I really like that. That's really fundamental somehow. But in nothing, I felt there should be some kind of interconnection between these things, right? There should be larger maps so you can select between them, coordinate them non-arbitrarily. I felt maybe that will be my life's work as a young scholar. And then, knock, knock. Wilbur has already done it, and it was years and years ahead, and I soaked it up like a sponge, and not only did it coordinate my sociological understanding and my understanding of the fields of theory and place those on the same map as other sciences, it also allowed me to integrate meditative experience into the same map of reality. And helped me to see phenomenology for what it was, first-person experience, and see that within that there is a whole realm, and in a sense, sciences of the mind, or at least things that can be systematized and learned. And that all of these things interact in a non-arbitrary manner. So, well, that really blew my mind open, and I really became an integralist in my DNA, right? And I wanted to, being a social scientist, being interested in politics and the development of society, I really wanted to use this stuff. I started using it in seminars without necessarily quoting Wilbur or anything, or referencing it. But I noticed this is powerful stuff. You can enter a space of kind of low-hanging fruit. Like if you have these, I think it's fair to say superior maps of reality, you see so many potentials. Like you can enter any field, any discussion, and you'll notice, they're not coordinating the maps here and here. They're missing this entire aspect of reality, or they're overlooking this thing, or they're not seeing the developmental perspective, which is a big thing in integral theory. So I felt this incredibly powerful, and I thought it should stand to reason that you could use this stuff for political change. So that's where I started, and wanted to create integral political movements and stuff in countries like in Scandinavia. But I also noticed, having worked with that a few years, that there were limitations to how well this could be used as a theory of social change. There were limits to how useful it was as a political theory, and there were also a bunch of scandals around cults and stuff that had amassed around the whole thing, and then behaviors of Wilbur himself, etc. I still admire and appreciate, but he never quite apologized for those things, and those things were never quite reckoned with, there were wounds that weren't reconciled or healed, and as those cracks kind of grew, and certain assumptions that I had that you could gather the people who would be, let's say, at the integral stages of development, who would kind of get this, and that they could see something together, they didn't seem to hold up. And I also noticed that there were things about the developmental models, or we noticed because I worked with other people, and that some people were highly complex and other people were highly spiritually developed, and that wasn't entirely accounted for. Sure, there were some theories about that stuff, but it wasn't like you didn't get that clarity of detail. So so when I found out there's another answer to what comes after integralism, which is more compelling than for instance, digimodernism, etc., which were more or less within this space of commentary on postmodernism, commentary upon itself, right? I saw a pretty good fit that, integral disconnects from everyday life and everyday reality with its wild New Age spirituality, from which much of its pathologies grows. It also often skips past a lot of the hard work of critical theory, of deconstruction, and so on, of critique, that comes from the postmodern realm, and people tend to, in the integral space, tend to be fairly allergic even to some of that, and adverse to it. So I felt Metamodern is much, as in the Dutch school, if we call them that, is much closer to that, and they are on the beat with what's genuinely happening within our culture. And integralism was terribly offbeat, right? So in my mind, these two things were, well, almost like two wings of a bird, right? That on the one hand, you need to connect to what's truly happening, sensitively connect what's truly happening within the arts, within architecture, within society, within its sensibility. That's where the spark of change is. And that's where the potential is for real movements. At the same time, integralism had the developmental perspective. It had holistic maps that you could employ. It had this connection to profound spirituality. It was holistic in that sense, that you could include inner dimensions, and the subjective states which you are part of, so as to draw upon those subjective states into your thought structures and then your actions, and then of course your interactions, so you can create institutions and cultures with new cultural sensibilities. Like so metamodernism in its original formulation was incredibly interesting, but not powerful as an instrument or vehicle of social change. And if you look at those intellectuals, they explicitly draw upon the postmodern code when they comment upon the economy and injustices of society and so on. And they use terms like neoliberalism, etc. So they didn't, to a full enough extent, see what they were, that they were part of constructing a next stage in a sense of society at large, which was much more clearly formulated in integralism. But within integralism, it came with too many pathologies. It had been too eager and grasped too far into the potentials of the future, and kind of lost itself oftentimes in that process. Right?
Yeah. So that's a great segue then for where I'm curious about where this leads us, because as you say, integral has these pathologies that it sort of overextends itself. It's reaching maybe a bit too much into the spiritual realm, and then well, I don't want to presume what the critique is, but like I know that elsewhere in a conversation moderated by Joe Lightfoot, you talked about that kind of thinking of metamodernism as you were formulating it as sort of a secularized or politicized integralism, and sort of in some ways taking out some of that pathological woo factor in order to ground it a little bit more. Is that a fair way of putting it? I mean, or
well, yes. I mean, you're giving my own words back to me, so
so of course it's fair.
I would kind of have to agree that yes. So the formulation of metamodernism that I attempted, and my friend Emil attempted, is then a politicization of integralism, in that we try to turn it from a general map of society is developed, humans develop, the systems of nature themselves develop along certain axes, but quite non-linearly, and with these leaps, and development always has a cost, and all of those things, right? And it didn't actually tell people or suggest to people, well, so what can we do together? And this was rampant in integral circles. So you can take a person like Mark Manson, a very active guy, and he writes self-help books and stuff. And he was into integralism, and he wrote an article about it, right? And he was a big, huge Wilbur fan. And then I think in New York or somewhere, he would join those integralist circles, and he noticed, like so many other people, that the integral circles were about being integral. And then you kind of got stuck on like, okay, oh, finally somebody who speaks my language, finally somebody who likes Ken Wilber, and we're going to change the world. This has cosmic importance, yo. And then you're 2 years later, you're in the same circle with the same people, and you're still talking about how you're integral and how people you know aren't. So I mean, it kind of didn't have a project, right? Get people to meditate. Well, that's not a good enough project, and this also has some shove stuff down people's throats dynamic to it. Yeah, and the very holistic nature of it kind of invites a certain kind of totalitarianism also, so it attracts people on the far right and so on. And of course, oftentimes postmodern critique has like post-colonialism, anti-speciesism, anti-racism, all of those things, gender perspectives. They haven't been powerfully enough integrated. So you try to move beyond them, but you're on a quicksand kind of. So which again depolitizes makes it non-political, and that makes it impotent ultimately. And when something is impotent, when it believes to be something else, well, you have the setup for cults, because then you become more and more trying towards yourselves and so on, which is what happened, right?
Yeah.
So the politicization and secularization, we segued naturally into that then, that given that integralism was nevertheless married particularly to certain aspects of certain versions of westernized Eastern philosophy, fundamentally Hinduism, fundamentally the Vedic tradition, but then it can go through and any strand of Mahayana Buddhism, etc., right? And it's particularly appreciated the more radical forms of such practices like Tibetan Buddhism or Zen, and given that that spirituality part is so central to integralism as we know it, it also tends to invite a lot of woo-woo, unfortunately, which was kind of the point of the whole thing to begin with, right? That you're not supposed to believe in energies and stuff, and nevertheless, people are so attracted to the spiritual side of it that those things do come back. And once those things do come back, together with a somewhat, like, we have the perspective of the totality, right? And then you kind of think, well, and we identify with this evolutionary impulse, and whoever has come farthest than that evolutionary impulse kind of knows what the universe itself wants, and then you have the whole setup for inward-looking guru worship, right?
So yeah, well, so then this for me, I don't mean to cut you off. I mean, finish your point, but I'm curious in where it all leads, because so all that makes a lot of sense. Then I wonder, what does a metamodern spirituality then look like in some ways, right? It's almost like maybe the term, even maybe when it showed up and you saw it for the first time, maybe you were like, oh no, they're
not at all.
Oh, okay. Well, because spirituality, I think, also is a really important part of the Hanzi books, and something I think that really is greatly to their credit and is deeply part of, I think, the sort of vision that there's a presumption that higher states and achieving, higher states in general is deeply important for society, et cetera, and building in some ways a political project with that end in mind. But I guess I want to tease apart then. So what is how do you parse out the woo from like an authentic, genuine metamodern spirituality? What are the components of the latter that would look at the former and be like, no, that's not it?
Well, actually, this segues to the last point I was making on the former topic, because secularized, politicized, you could also use the analogy conservative, right? That it's radical as well and wants to change the face of society and its structures and the nature of everyday life. But it's somewhat less eager and radical than what you might have seen in instantiations of the integral movement. Given so an analogy that fits is if the integralists were kind of like communists. They're like, oh, we're going to awaken everything. Everything is going to change. We're going to shift. We're going to get 10% of the population up to integral, and everything is going to change. The political metamodernist in mind is more like a social democrat. And that's like, okay, so maybe there isn't an overflowing revolution that is, well, like some millenarian promise going to flow over us around the next corner, but the directionality is correct towards a more existential civilization, towards spiritual maturity, towards spiritual connection, but that needs to be honed conservatively and step by step, because spirituality is such a powerful force that it is not easily contained within our social relationships. So that social relationships, kind of like an overloaded wire, tend to blow up if you overcharge them. Like okay, like there's this cosmic super duper truth. So then the switch is from an explicit in your face spirituality with an aesthetics that comes with that. So Alex Gray paintings like well, they're basically from the inside of an LSD trip, right? And beyond that, right? To these much subtler moves that are within the artworks that are analyzed by Vermeulen and Van der Acker and their whole community. They showed it in literature, they showed it in painting, they showed it in movies, they showed it in music, they showed it in architecture, how the spiritual is implicated. So that, for instance, you sprinkle little lamps around the city landscape, so it looks like stars, for instance, and somehow you subtly enchanted the urban landscape a little bit, right? Or you open up certain space, you use modern or you use contemporary architecture to kind of create a sense of subtle awe, like that whoever then feels ready for that, or whoever can pick up on that signal, feels a certain connection and inspiration, and for the others, they can just leave it alone, right? And they don't feel pressured, and they don't feel that need to resist it, right? And they don't have to believe wild promises about what's possible to experience as a conscious mind. Whereas integralism kind of presupposes that you have to believe in those wild promises. And all the people who do not have such spiritual experiences, which is majority, are going to think you're phony, even though you're not. And worse, some of them are going to be phony, or maybe they actually did have some awesome experiences and they kind of build an identity on it, and now they're invested in other people think they have it, and right. So the conservative or responsible way of using this incredibly powerful force that is spirituality is through is through a responsible implication of it that is constructed so it shines through between the cracks, kind of, right? You never throw it in anyone's face. You don't shake people like, come on, wake up. You subtly invite by creating generative conditions that invite towards a more cosmocentric worldview and towards the higher
Is
space,
that a means to an end though, or is that would be the ideal? Would be you could walk through the world and not have any spiritual inclination or experience whatsoever, but maybe if you did, you'd see it? Or is it more just like this is sort of an incremental? This is how we move towards a society in which spirituality is more pervasive and experienced.
So I would say both and. The both and is thus that we probably do need for our sanity, health, and survival a more spiritually rich society. We are spiritually impoverished and we are alienated, and there's something profoundly tragic about that, right? And we need to address that issue. On the other hand, metamodern spirituality, as suggested in Hanzi anyway, is that it doesn't view itself as superior to non-spiritual life. So if you have a family member and they don't have any spiritual inclinations at all, there's not a sense of like they haven't woken up, or like spiritual life is superior. This is what life is supposed to be like, right? And the other person lives in Maya or illusion or something else. It's rather that both have equal value, and they will both continue to exist, and they will both continue to kind of chafe against one another for eternity. But you can work on that point where it chafes to make it richer, right? So that non-spirituality, let's say, secularism and reductionism spills over more into spirituality and dispels some of its pathologies, and spirituality spills over and re-enchants what it can of an over-instrumentalizing hyper-rational, etc. civilization that we have, right? You want to
so one of the popular and important points in Wilber's work is the idea of the pre-trans fallacy, and you know that rationality, being non-rational, can be very easily confused with being either pre-rational or beyond rationality. For me, a lot seems to hinge in that domain there, though the presumption there is that it's possible to be trans-rational, in which spirituality exists after sort of modern rationality, which does suggest a kind of developmental progression, that you kind of move from kind of modern rationality maybe through postmodern deconstruction and then into kind of maybe a metamodern reconstruction and reenchantment. Though it sounds like a little bit what you're saying is more that maybe that kind of progression isn't there, that maybe that modern rationality needs to bleed more into I don't know, spiritual conceptions to kind of, as you say, kind of maybe exercise the demons a little bit.
So again, a kind of both and. I mean, I do believe that the attractor point is some kind of more profoundly spiritual civilization, but it's so far off that it's not. It shouldn't be guiding our steps at this point, because it becomes a distraction, and it also well, creates all of those leeways for fooling ourselves that we're somewhere we're just not, and the social institutions for containing those things and cultural innovations and so on just aren't in place, right? So likely we are going towards something like that, right? We have a certain version then of the trans-rational, and it really is contained within what was so beautifully observed as sincere irony by Vermeulen and van der Acker. That and in your own stuff too. I mean, you specifically wrote a poem about killing God and then reinventing the divine, right? So that there does appear to be a space within which the trans-rational can come online. But my concern is that most people who, and most settings where the trans-rational is thrown around as a term, they're not done killing God. You kill God when you are fully postmodern. Like moderns believe in God, they just believe in the atheist God because you have a third person perspective on everything, which is the real world, which is, ontic reality or whatever you want to call it. And they believe that's the real world. It's a gray, colorless machine world. But who the hell sees and makes sure that world is there? Well, they just shoved God behind the curtains, and then they kept the soul too. They just relabeled it the individual, and then for that same reason they can be awfully
so
anthropocentric.
Now this is an idea that I'm really interested by, though I also know that it's right on the knife's edge of being a really bad and terrible idea. I'll just set that out right at the get-go.
So wonderful. I love those ideas.
Yeah. So Hanzi talks a lot about, defines spirituality as being those things that pertain to the kind of highest states, and stages don't really come into the discussion as much in terms of conversations about spirituality. But here's an angle I'm interested in, and I'm curious if this would be anathema to you, or if you feel like, yeah, that could be something. So if you do think about these attractor points through time, and you do talk about, as you say, like the way that each sort of symbol stage kind of kills the god before it, but then kind of makes their own new one, right? What if you do see that as the evolution or the development of the God concept through these different symbol stages, right?
Yeah.
And so then the question for me becomes, well, what is the God concept in metamodernity, in metamodernism? Is that one of the reasons why this could be dangerous or problematic is another thing that Hanzi is sort of at pains to say, is like, we're not doing teleology here necessarily. And so there's sort of an anxiety around teleology here, and these sorts of narratives lead into a kind of, omega point kind of thinking and whatnot, which again, I don't know, maybe there's not something so terrible about that. But for me, I'm really interested in metamodern spirituality precisely in that area where it's a project of, well, what is the metamodern God, so to speak, that now we've, postmodernism slew the modern God, and we've, so how would you answer that question?
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question, but can you help me specify what you think is both promising and terrible about the idea? So I get you.
Right. So teleology has been, many people see it as being, oh, that's discredited. And again, even Hanzi wants to make that point. There are flattened versions of teleology that I think exist that are silly, which is like, when you talk about, an electron wants to go to this higher orbital or this or that, you anthropomorphize and you make things not what they really are. However, I do think that there can be more nuanced and interesting forms of teleological thinking, and that's one of the things that I'm personally interested in exploring more. But I think one of the dangers is that people do just sort of latch onto this sort of notion that, like, well, there is this God, and he's, or she, or it is, like, working behind the scenes to unfold itself, and It works almost mythologically as an idea, which in some ways might be seen as now we're back in the realm of pre-rational and mythological and all that. But at the same time, maybe not. Maybe it's transrational, or maybe it's a metamodern myth. Maybe we engage this sincerely, ironically, or whatnot. So these are
Yeah,
all
yeah.
questions.
Okay. Okay, it's such a huge question, and I do have responses to it, but let me find the right angle. Well, I mean, neurologically, for instance, left, right hemisphere, right? So superposition or oscillation is an important thing in between modern progress and science and hope and then deconstruction and the critique and nihilism, right? But there are other oscillations that I think capture the dynamic of the kind of metamodernism I'm speaking of at a yet deeper level. Which feed directly into spirituality and the future of God. I by the way, really enjoy Robert Wright's The Evolution of God, for instance. I think it's absolutely wonderful how he shows that out of a pantheon of gods in the Middle East, Java is the warrior god, and the warrior god people, they basically beat everybody up and said, now there's just Java, and then Java becomes the universal god and the universal truth, and then they start looking for universal truths. And then, in scholastics, people like, okay, if it's universal, then how does this fit together with Aristotle?
Right.
And then through that, they kind of triangulate quite obliquely their way into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and all of that. And the biggest geniuses of that time, of the scholastics, like Roger Bacon, they even foresaw modernity. He said, well, we'll have carts that roll by themselves. And how would he know that? We'll have ships that sail without winds. Well, he didn't imagine the mechanisms. He just imagined the cultural mechanisms through which we would find higher and higher truths, right? That would be applied. So the dangerous teleology is not to see attractor points; it's to see one attractor point, an omega point, and think that you're it, and that's bad news, because hey, we are very limited. One pair of eyes, one pair of ears. Like there's just no way I can have perspective enough to see the attractor point, right? But you can have it's kind of like in social science. You have middle range theory, like as a huge reaction to grand theorizing. That but you can still, with statistics, see this and this and that mechanism. It applies here and there and there. Well, okay, so then this middle range theory helps us predict the world, and then we can steer our ships better, right? So it's kind of like that. You can see many attractor points, right, and or suggested attractor points, and you can hold them somewhat more lightly, right? Hold them religiously. Oh yeah. Let me get back to that about the two parts of the brain, right? That if I know it's a simplification and everything, but it also holds a lot of truth. People have experienced strokes in one part of their brain, and then voila, something opens up in the other part, and so on. And the conceptual side helps us to be very reductive, right? And to think complex thoughts and to basically pick the world apart and then put it back together. Now, the intuitive side, which the right hemisphere, which steers the left side of our body, whereas also where we can feel our heart and stuff, is a place of intuition and wholeness, spiritual experience, and all the subtle shades of emotion and all of those things, right? So we can practice that move of oscillation, right? So in chaos magic with the CK, you deliberately make yourself as suggestible as you possibly can, so that your mind becomes incredibly gullible for a while, so you can believe preposterous things, so that you can change your emotional and spiritual wiring. And of course, people go on psychedelic trips for the same reason. And then on the other hand, we go to university and study logic. Logic is actually hot these days. It's the #1 course in Sydney, I heard, or something. And we can strengthen our capacity to pick things apart. Now, if we get stuck on one side, we're always a little bit angry at the world, because we can always pick things apart a little bit more than we can experience its fullness. So then we tend to be reductive and want to get back at the world and always show the crude mechanisms behind everything and so on. But on the other hand, if we are in the suggestible side, anybody can come and say, like, I am your guru, follow me and all will be well.
Right.
There is a point of light at the end of the tunnel. Just go here and first let me sleep with your wife. And the people particularly use situations when people have meditated, when they are in suggestible states, to affect them that way, right? So the landscape that kind of shows up is one where this oscillation is difficult, right? But the landscape that shows up is one of differentiation of those two things and reintegration of them, right? So that the enchantment side always informs the intellect, and the intellect side always informs the enchantment side and kind of reins it in.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't actually have to be conservative or step by step in a boring sense. It can be incredibly radical, because the farther you go in the disenchantment side, the more you can see through things, reconstruct things, invent things, and so on. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the more you see wholeness and enchantment and connection and warm data kind of feeds into this stuff. The more you can interconnect things, right, and have that drive from the higher states, right, mm-hmm. which is basically just loving the world. If you don't love the world, what are you using all that intellect for, right? It's a difficult landscape which kind of needs to have its polarities to function. So the polarities within each of us, but it's also within a population that you're going to have polarities between, more spiritual mm-hmm. people and more intellectual people, let's say, or you'll have the polarities even between societies and cultures, right, that lean towards one or the other, right? But that polarity is kind of where I feel, the future of God is to be found. The polarity gets better the farther it gets stretched, right? And the metamodern God, if we do allow ourselves a little omega point, is when they're stretched this, boom. They're stretched as far as humanly or transhumanly or whatever possible, right?
Which would seem to be the case if you consider that the kind of the postmodern God that's being killed is the void. It's the nihilistic, negation, right? Which if you're mm-hmm. then going to negate that almost in sort of extreme way, that would be kind of massively mm-hmm. stretched. That's just my little 2 cents as you're saying this, but it's an interesting.
So I mean, you might have heard me talk about this on another podcast, but my suggestion for such a God would be a God that is wholly sacred, yes, but their form of sacredness. Well, first of all, it needs to be multidimensional. So this is nice in syntheism, for instance. So, the God can, or there are versions of it in interrealism as well. They have first, second, and third person God and stuff like that. But in syntheism, you have atheos and pantheos and entheos. God in your experience, and one more, theos maybe, or
Cynthios.
Cynthios, yes. It needs to be multidimensional, but at the same time, it needs to sustain critique, right? So it's another form, like in Durkheim, as sociology of religion, he specifically says, and I know this from trivial matters such as just being a keeping people to behave on forums, right? If people run up and insult the collective or what is sacred in the group, and nothing happens, then the next person comes in and insults us as well. The next person comes in and insults us as well. Everybody talks about themselves as above the group. Then the group dissolves. So you kind of have to have certain taboos that, okay, you don't piss on the altar, right? Because if you piss on the altar, we're never going to congregate as a church again, because then it won't appear sacred and holy anymore, right? And the same is true for any little friends group, right? If you talk badly about the collective or the collective's values or something, or you what's the word?
Blaspheme.
Blaspheme is a good word. I was looking for desecrate. You desecrate the shrine, right? Then you kind of kill it off. However, if this God is going to sustain all deaths of all gods, right? Then it needs to be tolerant of blasphemy, right? So it would be a God that is sacred in that it is an altar that can be pissed upon and is insulted again and again, and nevertheless 3 days later lives, right? Or resurrects, right? So that's kind of where I got the concept of the headless God, right? He's always, or they are always on their way to the guillotine, right? And you chop the God's head off, and it's still sacred, right? So it would be a God that can take as all the postmodern critique in the world, and that we would differentiate ourselves from by critiquing it, right? By critiquing any belief structure, and whatever belief structure sustains that ferocious critique of the reductive mind again and again, well, is actually worth believing in, right? So basically, it would be a God that we attack and attack and attack, and then gives back to us by showing what's left after we've done all our attacks. So then that we can be ruthless to our own conception of God, and through that actually construct something that is solid enough for us to really believe in.
Well, that's why I'm
literally believe, not just ironically.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that's why I'm intrigued by this notion of sort of a meta religious meta narrative. I mean, if you look not at a bunch of different religions, I mean, this is a big problem politically too, is how do we all get along when everyone's got these absolutistic value systems and ideological commitments that are religiously rooted that can't kind of see past the fact it's like, well, it's, what's the name of our God and what are they like and this and that. But what I'm intrigued by is if you can articulate a narrative in which in which this like God is finding expression through all of these different specific narratives in a kind of developmental sequence, so that you could look at, say, traditional Christianity or medieval Christianity and maybe certain forms of Islam, and kind of see the fact that yes, content wise they differ dramatically, but in the kind of stage symbol set articulation of what the divine is, they're actually articulating something very similar. And so if you say, well, that is the thing that kind of unites them, and you can map that through time, from animism to warrior gods to the universal monotheistic deity and so on, then you've created a meta narrative of or a meta religious framework in which all of these different religious traditions exist, which I think is an intriguing idea in terms of being able to find a greater level coherence that maybe could provide some kind of ecumenical or interreligious dialogue in some ways, while seeing that beneath it or behind it or whatever, in some way there is something that is doing the evolving through time. And then it's sort of, well, what's that thing? Which I guess is sort of what you're saying. It's the headless God. It's the God that through time keeps getting its head chopped off and keeps reappearing maybe as something different. And then you kind of abstract that out and you say, whatever that is, that's a really cool thing. So that's, I'm not sure if we're saying exactly the same thing or if I'm mapping onto what you're saying or synthesizing here. But that's sort of the basic idea that I'm playing around with right now, at least as one. And maybe, well, this is in some ways it's a related, and maybe I don't want to overcomplicate this, but maybe framing it this way is just a stage specific kind of mythological framing of this idea, which could be expressed at all these different stages, essentially. In the description of it rationally, you could just say all these different societies through time have different gods, or you could, or pluralistically, you could say, well, different societies do this and that. So again, then you're kind of back to, well, what would be the metamodern God? And I guess maybe the word God is itself inherently kind of a mythological term. So the distinction even between the God concept and how spirituality works is maybe another thing that would need to be parsed out a little bit more, religion, spirituality.
Yeah, for me personally, I'll try to comment on your larger point, but just on the last part here. For me personally, I think I prefer talking about God and religion, right? Because it's brave, because it's outrageous, right? And because it connects to those truths that were nevertheless there before modern skepticism. Modern skepticism says, well, if there's no God in the clouds, there's no God at all. It leaves a lot of residuals, doesn't it?
Right.
Well, not least the fact that you already kept God in your atheism, right? Because kind of presupposes it. And in the early moderns like Newton and stuff like that, it was actually an explicit theory, like it's this is God's order, blah blah blah, right? But whether or not it's explicit or implicit is there. But what I mean is there are truths which Jordan Peterson, who I'm not such a big fan of, but he makes a good he does a good job with differentiating between existential truths and literal truths, and that within Christianity you find plenty of existential truths that you're unwise to jettison just because you don't buy certain parts of the mythology, right? Or don't literally buy them anyway. But to get to those truths, you have to at least take the mythology seriously enough, and that takes an ironically sincere stance towards them, right? So I prefer religion, I prefer God, and I prefer even say religion to spirituality, because spirituality, as I've defined it, then pertaining to the higher states, whereas religion, well, the whatever interconnecting principles, that fundamental principles you have of reality itself, right? And your place in it.
Well, that's it. I was going to ask you about that actually, because I felt this thing in the background that was there in the listening society, which was certain kind of, for lack of a better term, like a metaphysical framework that just wasn't. It's like we're not going to necessarily go there. We're not going to touch that. In some ways, we're going to say, well, I'm not quite trying to get all metaphysical here, but it did seem to be in there, like, if that makes sense. And this is maybe for me how you could start to parse, like, if, yeah, so if spirituality is
Yeah.
first person state subjective, then what sort of metaphysical ideas or commitments are kind of lying behind all these ideas, if that makes sense? And that might be where you'd locate some of this more religious language.
Well, yeah. The idea would be that the higher states, you actually, not necessarily in an empirical sense, but in a, well, post-rational sense, you see the world more clearly, right? That there is a higher or deeper truth to them. And by definition, the lower states are when you're stuck in some kind of illusion, right? So that the higher states that we experience, the greater truth of the universe and it all, we're actually expressing and seeing and acting upon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you take Jesus, like, it's difficult to say about the actual historical person, but it appears as though there has been running around a person like that, and that he had a stunt of some few months of his life, around 30, where he was just on a roll. He was in high states all the time, right? And the things kind of just flowed out of him because, well, he just saw the interconnections, right? He's like, whoa, we're all interconnected. We're all God. I'm the son of God. Like, we should be loving each other. We have no reason at all to judge one another. We don't have to chastise each other. We have to purify our own minds. Blah 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 blah. Like, and how did he reach through to all of that? Was it through philosophical discourse, painstakingly putting one thing together? No, he had no access to any of that. He just downloaded it by virtue of spiritual experience, right? And that's the carrying capacity of the New Testament, really, that it came out of somebody having really high states for a longer stretch of time, and just being in a fury of enacting that stuff, right?
Right. So wouldn't a metamodern society be one that is actively cultivating basically a higher God concept, which is to say more clear understanding of the world as it is, which is an expression of a deeper truth, that in whose context, or in which context, whatever God concept is present there would be presumably of a more lucid and more illuminating form, which is to say that maybe the God concept has evolved. Is that a fair?
I mean, again, I have to answer with a boring yes and no, or both. The yes part is that, basically, like you said it, that, wait a minute, if it is true that higher states in a spiritual sense bring us to higher truths, and that is a metaphysical truth, right? That there is some kind of fundamental fountain of love, and we can realize it, but we shouldn't believe in it before we realize it, because then it can be misused in so many ways, right? But given that does appear to be an attractor point, that the wiser somebody gets, the kinder they get, right? It's not the opposite. We could have lived in a world that the more insight somebody gathers and the better they understand the situation and themselves and one another, the more evil they get, right? But that's not the case. And whenever we can see that we acted evilly or badly or etc., it's always because, well, there was some misconception of something, right? And truth does appear to cascade into morality, which does appear to cascade into beauty, right?
Which is a deeply metaphysically optimistic stance to take, I would say, about reality, which
Well, yes, but I think there is a very strong case can be made for it, right? That like, well, just an example. You have a problem in your family, and now your in-law wants to break off contact. And then you find out that the in-law thinks you hate their guts, but you don't. That's a misunderstanding. So you write a loving letter and explain that I love you. You're a great in-law. Always respected you. I'm not sure where you might have gone wrong to give you another impression. They respond and they say, oh, well, that's a relief. Well, should we talk? And then both people explain, well, I've kind of been busy. So that's why I haven't visited. And I went through a crisis. That was what kept me so busy. And the other person explains, well, yeah, and I went through a major depression. So I saw the world in really dark shades. And that's why I interpreted it that way. And you understand each other. And then, not always, because understanding is imperfect, but on average, and over time, better understanding of the truth tends to lead to a better loving relationship and mutual understanding, right?
So this is a question I wanted to ask too, and probably I want to be wary or cognizant of time too. So maybe this can be one of our concluding points or avenues of inquiry. But I'm curious, in the Hanzi model of these different 4 kind of areas of development, one of the really important ones is cognitive development in the model of hierarchical complexity, the MHC, which is really important for really the whole kind of broader program and model and everything like that. And I think a very fascinating and profound thing in itself. So my kind of question here, it came up for me when I was reading this and relates to everything that we're talking about now, is it fair? Is it accurate, or would it be too inaccurate or too unfair to say that consciousness is somehow being assessed in that developmental stage framework? Or maybe framed better as a question is, what is the relationship of the idea of consciousness to what is being assessed in the MHC? I mean, you could talk about it as cognitive complexity. You could talk about it as cognitive. I don't know. You talk about intelligence being also, vertical and horizontal. The IQ is sort of the horizontal, and the stage is the vertical. So in some ways, intelligence is what's being construed here. But of course, even in kind of general parlance, intelligence, consciousness, this and that. So I think you can probably see a little bit around this question of where it might be kind of at least headed or insinuating. But maybe just tackle that first. I mean, what is the relationship of consciousness to what is being studied in the development of the MHC model?
Well, I usually avoid consciousness, and I believe for good reasons. It's very easily misused, and it easily leads to sloppy philosophy.
Right.
But in the I do feel that metamodernism, from the from the philosophical engine that I try to operate it and enact it in the world, does lean towards some kind of at least openness to pantheistic visions, meaning that neither consciousness nor extended reality in extensia is fundamental, but that they co-contain one another, some kind of fractal, that we have no instances whatsoever of any object that we have experienced outside of consciousness. Hence, consciousness touches on all objects of extension, all material objects in space and all of that, and time. At the same time, we have no instances of consciousness that does not seem to be materially bound. So that it appears that consciousness is, in a sense, a function of matter and its configuration itself, right? So both of those things appear to be equally true, and both appear to be equally fundamental to the nature of reality. And then consciousness would probably not have arisen at any one point, because you could easily imagine a world of robots which were still self-organizing. So they must have had the quality of consciousness, in some sense, must have been there to begin with. So that's a metaphysical part of the philosophical engine that I operate. However, in Swedish, for instance, and other languages, we have a difference between consciousness and consciousness, or something. Well, so medvetande, consciousness, and medvetenhet, which would translate more perhaps to awareness. And I think that's an important distinction, right? So if you do view consciousness as that primary, it becomes less, just feels less pertinent to measure it captured in, say, we need more consciousness, higher consciousness, or we need conscious capitalism, all of those things. But rather that consciousness, if it is materially, at the same time materially configurated, we need such configurations that create, if a consciousness is a field that we can experience in non-dual states as a kind of ground of being, thing also in Western philosophy and Heidegger. But it's a kind of ground of being, and then this ground of being has it has elevations in its topology somehow, and those elevations can look back on the former, on its source, right? And then then kind of awareness of itself can increase, right? And then awareness as such can be genuinely differentiated into those different forms of knowing. So knowing itself as an object would be complexity or hierarchical complexity. Knowing itself as a feeling subject would be the development of depth. And knowing the nature of itself, or the source of its own consciousness, would be the states, right? And knowing the different code systems with which to describe oneself, for instance, picking up, I don't know, psychoanalytical theory or something, would be a collective vision of the self, right? So that these are increases of awareness, but we kind of leave the sacredness or the inviolability of consciousness intact. And I think it's an important point also in the sense that, so yes, I'm a developmentalist. I do believe in developmental perspective. I do think those provide us with a sense of direction. But at the same time, there's such a thing as developmental violence. I don't know, Europeans of the 19th century, they saw that they had a more universal order than others, and then they colonized the hell out of the world, and we're still paying the price for it, right? Collectively, and we're still haunted by those ghosts, for instance, in the form of Chinese revengism, right? So I feel that that well, this really goes back to what you said earlier, both about the developing God and about meta narratives or meta religions that can interconnect religions. That to do so non-violently is to actually just establish those rituals and practices and theologies among those who they resonate around, and from there on, just interconnect other faiths in manners that are resonant or meaningful to them, right? Or mutually resonant or meaningful, because you can still learn an infinite amount from any of the thousand plateaus, kind of, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. No, I mean, that's there's an inherent danger, and maybe this is the developmental violence that you're gesturing towards, is that if you start to conflate or correlate, cognitive complexity, and therefore, like, your grasp on ultimate truth, and thus like your divinity or your sacredness or something, then you're in some scary territory, right? Because then that does lead to these sorts of or at least opens the door to a whole bunch of misuses of these sorts of models, which, I mean, again, Hanzi's always in some ways walking that tightrope of acknowledging that these are dangerous ideas and therefore need to be applied correctly. So that there's a lot hanging on these issues, and it's very important that but we also can't risk the opposite. And in my view, in the sense of needing to re-enchant the world, broadly speaking, and the need to do something about the alienation, then yeah, the scope of meta narratives does seem to be kind of incumbent upon us to start to shape and to try to clarify a bit. And so, while acknowledging that they're dangerous ideas, so with that kind of postmodern, not quite, well, in some ways an incredulity towards them, but certainly a skepticism or a hyper aware, just a hyper awareness about their potential pitfalls and dangers that we've learned from the history of modernity and totalitarianism. But also being able to say, well, but these are meeting certain urgent needs of our moment, of our society, in ways which, again, Hanzi articulates in many ways himself.
Well, yeah. So given then that there isn't actually we don't subscribe to, like, for instance, Eckhart Tolle. Like, Eckhart Tolle has the highest consciousness, and now the world is going to raise consciousness, and we're all going to wake up, and then we're going to live in an enlightened society, etc. Right? Because it is imperialist. They're not wrong, right? In whatever way or form it takes, right? And at the same time, and here's really where sincere irony and proto-synthesis is important. At the same time, we should do our best to say our highest truths, right? So thus, we are free to get out of whatever roles, confines, masks, persona, like all of those things that restrain us, and go to those farther reaches within ourselves and speak from them as though we're prophets. And that's the ironic prophet, right? So the headless God has prophets, and those are the ironic prophets, right? Mm-hmm. So the ironic prophets do point towards omega points, but they don't actually believe in them that much, right? They just think that's the best hypothesis I've got, right? And I'm going to be beheaded like everybody else. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge difference, right, from the post-Faustian or traditionalist religions, where when Mohammed did move a mountain and he came back, and now he had the word of God, and now nothing else really needed to be said. And then after that, you can fight about interpretations. but you can actually fight about the word of God. Whereas we just pretend for a moment that we can speak as prophets or speak with the voice of God, and I think that's kind of part of what you're exploring in your series.
Yeah, very much.
And allow ourselves that, and that really feeds into the thing we bring, the thing brought up in the second Hanzi book, Nordic ideology, that there are certain regimes of emotions that control us. And once we have gotten to this kind of postmodernity thing that we're in now, and we're working through shame, and everybody is in circles and talking about embarrassing things and like throwing off the shackles of shame once you're already thrown off the shackles of guilt and the shackles of just tyranny and fear. And then after the shame of your bad of all the bad stuff, right? All the I was ridiculous when I did that. I've been I have this and that addiction, blah 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 blah. I have this and that sexuality, stuff like that. And but once we've thrown that off, we're still left with shame. But now we're ashamed of well, our strengths, what Jung called the golden shadow, right? And we're ashamed of like those higher potentials that call us, that of those moments of clarity, how they radically comment upon our lives, and what pale shadows we are of those potentials, right? And we're ashamed of what others might think of us if we try to act upon those. So that's a kind of internalized envy, or what I call sklaven moral, or slave morality, which isn't what Nietzsche meant with the word, but I think it's such a useful word. I still want to employ it there, so that in order for us to practice this kind of religion, we need to collectively allow one another to be not just an okay dude or a person, but to be a prophet, right? Which is really radical if you think about it, right? Like, and just for a moment become really incredulous, and that's where the whole chaos magic thing comes in,
Right.
and being suggestible, being gullible for a moment, being open to taking up the higher states of another person, or the little pearls that they have been able to acquire during their highest states, or their best, when they are their best selves, right? And as such, we can co-construct these prophets, and a good practice is to keep them partly fictional, because it helps with the differentiation.
Yeah, no, this sensibility is precisely what drew me to the cultural metamodernist framework originally, or the Dutch school, as you will. And because this was precisely what I saw there. And it doesn't come out as much in conversations about metamodern spirituality, but I think it's really crucial. And there's that way in which it's directly related to, I think, to the disenchantment of the world as well, and to alienation, because if you are not allowing yourself to experience something, the enchantment of life, even in a serious play context, even in a certain kind of, then you're just totally foreclosing the possibility of there being some kind of enchantment. And so there needs to be a kind of audacity to step outside of the foreclosed option of like, no, you can't say that, or you can't think that, or who do you think you are? Like, that doesn't happen, stuff like that. And yet not in a completely detached way that it's just now you're in, one cuckoo land or psychosis or something. But there's that element that keeps it, Vermeulen and von den Acker talking about irony pulling back the enthusiasm, if it goes too far, as it were. And so creating those kinds of containers are precisely, I think, what a metamodern spirituality would be attempting to kind of do. And yeah.
And also just note on that. Given that religion, art, even spirituality are modern concepts, right? So the words kind of betray us, right? Because we're kind of stuck in the modern language about these things, about how modernity kind of, well,
Compartmentalizes.
compartmentalize the world, right? Well, I mean, there was a lot of merit to that, and then stuff like Confucianism is a religion, is not, but it's still kind of gets squeezed into that category, right? And the kind of religion of the future, like the arts of the future, are likely to escape out of those confines, right? So I'm thinking of ways to set our souls on fire, but that's not as in a permanent revolution, because there's movement and institution and falling in love and all of those things, radical things, they happen during the movement phases. But we are in a movement phase. Things are moving. We are changing. So it does make sense for us to have that fire now. But then you can draw on any of the qualities, right? So the piety of Christianity, like the piety of the missionary, or the monk or the nun, right? Or the saint, even better, the saint is the best picture, right? Or the Buddhist version, right? Some of purity of mind, right? Purity of intention, or non-attachment, right? Or you can draw on the occult, right? On I don't know, Satanism or something, and like just the fire within, the will, etc., like the fierceness, the carnal, or revolutions, that like, and it's kind of my favorite, actually. We can reconstruct the fire in the eyes of the revolutionary. That okay, so maybe I'm not actually going to run up on some barricades and fight city guards, but I am an enemy of modernity. I do believe that modernity is beautiful, but just like the Roman Empire was. But I have to be against it because it's also untenable and unethical, right? So I have all the right in the world to just get that mad stare for a moment or two, or even more prolonged, right? And just feel into that fire. And I feel as a metamodernist community, we haven't quite gotten there. But I do believe that if we do find the right rituals and modes of containing and constructing and restraining those things, we can draw on those energies, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's, well, one, when you're talking about this, it makes me think of Layman Pascal talks about the sacred style, inhabiting the sacred style. And this is partly why I was so interested in aesthetics and religion, or religion and the arts, is because when you remove it a little bit from some of its kind of metaphysical assumptions for a minute and view it more as something like, how is this something I perform? And this, of course, also goes back to some of that chaos magic stuff. But it's the doing, it's the performative act, it's the putting on, it's in some ways taking off the other mask, but putting on another in order to tell a certain truth and to embody that, which you can't do if you're just, I'm not allowed to do that. But more to the point, it's precisely the project of trying to create or co-create some of these rituals that you're talking about, co-create some of these containers, that I feel like is a really crucial project that is certainly something that I'm deeply interested in, trying to find people to engage in that co-creation. So
I mean, there is something to it, just in terms of attractor points, intellectually speaking. Now, like a few years ago, we had stuff like Simon Critchley, the Faith of the Faithless. We had Roberto Unger, The Religion of the Future, or something like that. And Wilbur wrote a thing, The Religion of the Future, of his own. and you had, of course, syntheism show up around at the same time, all of them. And now we have stuff like metamodern spirituality, and I think Jamie Wheel's stuff I
Yeah,
didn't,
definitely. Yep.
but I mean, but just hearing talk about it, that he wants to create, you know, in so a well-informed, responsible psychedelic culture with deliberately created rituals, and his title is brilliant. Recapture the rapture, right? The rapture, and I think there is something moving there, but we are seeing early sprouts, right? And these things work in such well non-linear manners, right? We sow seeds, and then there are moments, and the moments can be transformative, and then things kind of fall down and go back to normal, but or the projects even fail, and then they're traumatic. But there is a kind of learning curve that I think has begun just now, with what could be loosely termed as metamodern spirituality.
I totally agree, and that's what's really exciting to me, is to try to, bring these strands together and try to see it beyond just, intimations, but actually try to create that stuff and see it, come into the world in a real way, and then to change the world through that, and do the whole dialectical thing. But I mean, we could keep going, and it brings up a whole bunch of things I'd love to talk to you more about. Maybe sometime in the future we could revisit some of these things and develop them a little bit more and go into some other directions. But time wise, let's wrap it up. Is there anything that you want to throw out to people? Let them know where things stand with volume 3, or anything that you're working on.
Well, yeah, well, let's not use a lot of time on that. Emil sent me 550 pages from volume 3, but we're reworking it so much. It's well, it might take a while.
Gotcha.
And there's the Hanzi self-help book coming up, which also has well, at least a few angles on metamodern spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a kind of show it, don't tell it book, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't even talk about metamodernism, but about finding sublime mediocrity is the basic principle. Well, yeah, I mean, just on this topic, I think there's it has arrived a kind of priesthood of metamodern spirituality. I think you're definitely part of it. A friend of mine, we can talk about that later, wanted to have a little certificate as a metamodern priest to show his grandma, who thought he should be a priest, but
I love it.
took another direction. So we can come up with a little fun performance ritual for that. But I mean, I just also want to mention Will Franks and Julian Davies, who I feel have contributed impressively to this field. And I think somehow this should be organized in some kind of network that begins at least to work with rituals. And if you look at these Triple H populations, hackers, hippies, hipsters, there's the fourth age, the quadruple H, hermetics.
Right.
So this particularly kind of draws the hermetics. People are interested in the symbols and the occult and stuff like that. But there is something particular. Well, there's for all four, but particularly for the hippies and the hermetics and a little bit the hipster types, something to come around. There's something that needs to be constructed, right? Some kind of religious practices that are invented in situ, like they're invented then and there, but according to certain formulas. So they have certain stable elements and certain creative elements, right? And yeah, that's something I'd really like to encourage people to try to get together around and
Yeah.
experiment around. And I don't think it even has to become dangerous, because with this wiring that, okay, we only have ironic, half fictional prophets. We are aware that the power must be distributed. We are aware that the moments of insight are far in between, and that they're magically constructed through serendipity, through certain moments, but we can create generative conditions for them. Uh, I mean, if given all of those things in place, and that we should be critical of the very categories of religion and spirituality as we have known them, and think about them from beyond those categories, right? Um, well, I think there's something there that I'd be very, very curious about. So I just want to throw that out
Yeah.
as
No, I
whoever's listening, right?
100%. I mean, so many thoughts there. Just real quick. One is just that, so like I have a place now that I'm operating called Sky Meadow Retreat, and I would love it if these sorts of things could happen in person in situ, and like get together in the flesh and do these sorts of things, both the work and both the creation of the rituals and the rituals themselves, so to speak. But also being aware of the fact that so much of this community is sort of in a diaspora kind of around the world sort of context. So trying to do things in situ in many ways is going to look like doing them online, doing them, and trying, and whether that's in social media groups or in YouTube videos or whatever, or Zoom calls. I mean, some of these rituals are probably going to be digital rituals of some kind or another, which has pros and cons. Um, and and further, yeah, I'm super. I mean, Julian Davies in that Towards the Metamodern Spirituality article is really fantastic. He's going to be on the podcast soon, I think sometime in the next couple of weeks, and he's great. Will Franks, similarly, he actually reached out to me many months ago, and he's just brilliant. And I know that he and Julian work together, and so he reached out to me because he'd found some of my work, and there's just a lot of synergy there between all that. So I agree. I mean, that's a great idea, and I'd love to. Maybe I just need to start facilitating those sorts of conversations more in terms of getting into the actual logistics of it all. But yeah. Well, hey, thank you so much, Daniel. This has been such a pleasure, and it's again finally it's a great honor and a joy to talk with you and to meet you. And I'm thoroughly enjoying the audiobook version right now, the Listening Society, and it's sort of sinking in a whole new way. So anyway, take care, and yeah, maybe we'll talk again before long.
Yeah, and it's been fun for me too. Like I told you, I had fairly low energy going in, being on too many Zoom calls, and now I actually feel more energized. So that's very promising. Says something about the power of metamodern spirituality, doesn't it?
It's
Okay, have a
electric.
good one.
All right, take care, my friend.
You too. Ciao.